Hidden just streets away from Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cione's residence sits a local filling station. It is the one glaring blind spot every single reporter missed. Tucked inside sits a crypto kiosk, a machine built for anonymously purchasing digital currency, viewing accounts, or pulling out cash. Every single extortion letter following Nancy Guthrie's vanishing explicitly requested Bitcoin. Federal agents quietly swept that specific convenience store. Not the location by Nancy's property, but the one right near her relatives. Unearthing this clue from a wildly botched official timeline changed everything. Tugging at that single thread unraveled a massive web. On January 11th, the exact evening a shadowy figure was captured lurking outside Nancy's doorstep. An unknown user digitally mapped her residence. The ping traced straight back to Tucson, no virtual private networks, no distant states. Tucson, the precise town where Annie and Tommaso reside 4 miles away. It is also where Derek Kayla, the suspect detained for that digital extortion message, fired off his threat. But he never messaged Savannah Guthrie out east. He specifically targeted Tommaso's private mobile device. That led me to a glaring piece of day one evidence that investigators seemingly ignored. Nancy's vital cardiac prescriptions sat entirely abandoned on her countertops. She needed those pills by 10 o'clock at night. Tommaso brought her home at 9:50. Authorities confirmed missing a day was a death sentence. Think about it. An abductor's payday relies entirely on a breathing victim. You grab the life-saving meds. They were completely visible. It takes 5 seconds. Yet, they vanished without them. I just spent a week dissecting every extortion letter, analyzing each threat and schedule, poring over all known dialogues between the alleged captors and the search party. My conclusion? The whole abduction-for-profit narrative is a total lie. The core foundation established by Cameron Guthrie's initial dispatch simply collapses under scrutiny. The abandoned pills destroy it. The written demands contradict it. The physical locations completely shatter it. I am exposing exactly what dismantles this official story. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let us dive into the darkness. Early February brought a disturbing wave of blackmail. Various recipients received different menacing messages. For the very first time, we are piecing together the chilling contents of these hidden threats. Initial contacts hit on February 2nd and 3rd hours after Nancy vanished. The ultimatum? $4 million in crypto by 5 o'clock on the 5th. Missed that window, and the toll skyrocketed to $6 million by 5 in the evening on February 9th. These letters weaponized fatal ultimatums, promising lethal consequences for delays. They even provided a legitimate, verifiable blockchain receiving address, proving this was a fully operational digital vault ready for massive deposits. What these documents contained should have dominated every single breaking news broadcast nationwide. The author leaked highly classified crime scene secrets, like the exact destruction of an exterior security bulb, and precisely where Nancy's smart device was resting indoors. This was tightly sealed law enforcement intelligence, details strictly limited to the person standing inside her living room the night she disappeared. Let that sink in. The drafter of this extortion was either physically present close enough to spot the electronics and smashed lights, or they were directly fed intel by the intruder. No other logical explanation exists. You do not just magically predict where personal tech is charging in a stranger's house. A major tabloid obtained a primary document. Their founder publicly noted its immaculate formatting, deliberate spacing, and highly advanced word choice. We are not talking about frantic scribbles on scrap paper. This was a methodical, highly literate manifesto penned by a professional. Contrast that with our doorbell camera suspect, a masked figure wearing a cheap camping backpack, strapping a firearm rig completely backwards over his coat, blindly using foliage to hide from lenses, and moving with zero combat training. These two criminal profiles clash entirely. The mastermind drafting demands is absolutely not the amateur pacing that deck. The intellect gap is massive. The capabilities are worlds apart, and the finesse is unequal. This points to a larger conspiracy with several actors, dividing the brains from the brawn, or these letters were fabricated later to frame a totally different motive. Because on February 11th, another bizarre message dropped at the tabloids. This secondary communication did not match the initial blackmailer. They asked for a single coin, around $66,000 to $77,000 back then, to unmask the true culprit. They framed themselves as an outside observer holding secrets, not the actual abductors. But here's the terrifying puzzle piece the media completely ignored. This shadowy informant stated they previously reached out directly to the inner circle, specifically targeting Annie and Cameron, completely bypassing Savannah. Something is incredibly wrong regarding Annie and Cameron, the two siblings rooted in Arizona, practically hovering over ground zero. Ask yourself, why would a shadowy informant sitting on explosive abduction details bypass Savannah entirely, reaching out to them instead? She was the sister holding the massive megaphone, the vast wealth, and the exact celebrity status that supposedly triggered this nightmare. Maybe the whisperer knew the dark truth hovered right over Annie and Cameron. Maybe they realized the sinister secret was never hiding in New York but buried in Tucson. Then, out of nowhere on February 18th, a fresh message dropped. They switched the digital currency, completely ditching Bitcoin. The tone turned vicious, painting a bloody picture of what would happen if the cash stopped, and included a brand new digital wallet address. Federal agents immediately looped in officials down in Mexico to trace the digital paper trail. Instantly, the terrifying letters ceased entirely. The public extortion vanished after mid-February. 7 agonizing weeks of absolute dead air from the phantom perpetrators. Then came the bombshell. Savannah did an interview with Hoda Kotb, spilling a secret that had been haunting the margins of this investigation. She confessed one of the ransom demands read exactly like an apology. The shadowy figure behind the pen actually showed remorse, claiming they had zero clue about Nancy's delicate physical state. They stated they were completely unaware of her failing heart. Just let the absolute insanity of that sink in for a second. A monster soulless enough to drag an 84-year-old grandmother out of her own bed at 2 o'clock in the dead of night, wearing nothing but sleepwear and bare feet, without a single vital pill to keep her alive, suddenly drafts a letter whining, "Our bad. We never knew she was in such bad shape. Real underworld predators simply do not function that way." That completely shatters the psychological profile of a ruthless abductor. Dig through 60 years of hostage files, and you will not find a single instance of a captor mailing a sympathy card to relatives whining about unforeseeable medical emergencies. It is entirely unheard of. Zero historical precedent exists, mainly because the twisted psychopath capable of terrorizing Nancy Guthrie completely lacks the human empathy required to feel a shred of guilt, let alone document those tears on paper and mail it to the grieving family. Plus, analyze the glaring psychological whiplash between these distinct messages. The initial letters were icy, calculated ultimatums demanding heavier payouts, the signature of a dominant predator. Suddenly, this so-called apology pivots into something sickeningly gentle and sorrowful. You are looking at two entirely different minds. The psychological baselines are completely incompatible. Imagine a corporate shark drafting a merciless extortion plot, only for the next page to read, like a condolence note from the sweet lady next door. The vibe is completely off. Either a different writer took over, or the ultimate endgame shifted entirely. Those early letters were carefully staged to mimic a classic hostage scenario. But that apology? That was a calculated move to force closure, handing the siblings an excuse to call off the bloodhounds, tricking them into accepting that Nancy perished in a tragic, clumsy raid, rather than being intentionally slaughtered by a familiar face. Now, dissect the absolute paranoia hidden within the timeline. Those core extortion letters landed on February 2nd and 3rd, barely 48 hours after she vanished. Yet the initial payment cutoff was set for 5 o'clock on February 5th, a full 4 days post-abduction. When you hold a breathing captive and need quick cash, you never stall for 4 days. You prove that the asset is still breathing right out of the gate. You shove a receiver against the victim's face or snap a quick Polaroid featuring the morning headlines. You manufacture pure panic because terror equals leverage. Yet these masterminds set ticking clocks without ever proving their leverage was even real. Not a single snapshot, no frantic audio clips, no blurry video footage, absolutely zero evidence, proving Nancy Guthrie had a pulse when the ink dried on those demands. The relatives played ball. Savannah and her siblings recorded desperate video pleas for the public. They stared into the lens and practically begged, swearing they got the message, promising to wire whatever astronomical figure it took to bring their mother home. Those broadcasts hit national airwaves. A massive $1 million bounty hit the streets. Then, absolute crickets. No secret handoffs. Zero drop-off coordinates. No heartbeat confirmed. The perpetrators totally ghosted. Clocks ran out, the mailboxes went empty, and that massive fortune gathered dust. Former federal investigator Steve Moore dropped a chilling theory: that gigantic payout remains untouched because the only souls who actually know the truth are the murderers themselves. That is not a wild guess. That is a calculated, terrifying, expert conclusion. Had a random street crew snatched Nancy for a payday, that $1 million bounty would have shattered the mystery weeks ago. Someone would have snitched. A suspicious lover, a jailhouse confidant, or some loose-lipped barfly would have sold them out by now. In traditional stranger abduction scenarios, massive cash bounties always buy a credible witness. But when the inner circle pulls the trigger, lips stay sealed, because opening them guarantees a lifetime behind bars. Which leads to the darkest possibility. What if an abductor never actually penned that letter? What if it was drafted by a desperate insider trying to aggressively steer Savannah's radar away from a very specific, dangerous truth? A puppet master who desperately required Savannah to buy the lie that her mom perished in a clumsy criminal mistake, blinding her to the horrifying reality of a calculated hit by a familiar face. Because a random, bungled home invasion ending in death is a heartbreaking misfortune. But an orchestrated execution by someone deep inside Nancy's trusted orbit, that is pure evil. And that bizarre apology, that fake sympathy about her weak heart, is the singular smokescreen hiding the monster. Which brings us directly to the missing pills. A single oversight blew this entire case wide open. The ransom narrative? It's a complete lie, shattered by basic common sense. Picture the crime scene on the morning of February 1st. Nancy Guthrie's critical heart pills sat abandoned on her counter. She needed those meds by 10 p.m. Her ride dropped her home at 9:50. That life-saving prescription sat right in plain sight, totally exposed in the kitchen. Local law enforcement went straight to the press, confirming a chilling timeline. Depriving Nancy of those drugs would kill her within 24 hours. Medical specialists painted a similarly grim picture, capping her absolute maximum survival window at just 72 hours. Think like a kidnapper for a second. If your ultimate goal is cashing in on a living hostage, grabbing those pills is your top priority. That little bottle guaranteed a payday. Leaving it behind meant watching your captive expire, instantly destroying any bargaining power. The attacker didn't need a medical degree or any clue about heart disease. Sweeping everything into a bag takes 5 seconds. You've already breached the perimeter, you're already snatching the target. Yet those life-saving capsules stayed behind. And the trail of bizarre oversights hardly stops there. The victim's cell remained resting beside her bed. In a legitimate hostage scenario, that device becomes your primary weapon for negotiations. You'd force her to speak, proving she survived. At the very least, you'd swipe the hardware to dodge GPS tracing by desperate relatives. The intruder abandoned her cell, ignored her handbag, walked right past hard currency stuffed inside the wallet. The medicine stayed put, meaning the suspect only wanted one thing: the victim herself. This points to 3 deeply disturbing possibilities. Maybe the intruder lacked medical intel, but that completely shatters the illusion of a masterfully orchestrated plot. We're talking 3 weeks of intense stalking. They effectively blinded security systems, studied every inch of the floor plan, and weaponized everyday garden planters under the cover of night. Nobody pulls off a Black Ops breach just to ignore vital prescriptions. Alternatively, the attacker knew exactly what was there and simply brushed it off. And if that's true, bringing this woman back alive was never part of the grim equation. The extortion angle was either a manufactured distraction, an afterthought, or sheer panic caused the perpetrators to abandon logic mid-invasion. Here's where the audio devices shift the entire investigation. Every single night, this elderly woman removed her heavy-duty earpieces. Stripped of that tech, she lived in total silence. Imagine an intruder bursting in, barking aggressive demands to stand up immediately. Demanding she stay quiet and follow orders meant absolutely nothing. She couldn't comply because the commands literally fell on deaf ears. Picture towering over an 84-year-old target in pitch blackness. You're screaming directions, getting zero reaction. She refuses to budge, entirely unaware of your threats, while you have no idea a medical condition renders her completely oblivious. Tension explodes. A sudden shove, a violent struggle, her skull hitting the bedside table, and instantly the scene turns gruesome. That exact chain of events, the missing earpieces, the ignored threats, the sudden violence perfectly rationalizes the crimson stains near the doorway. It unravels the mystery of a spotless home featuring one brutalized threshold. The abandoned pills make terrifying sense now. The operation imploded immediately. Panic forced a sudden tactical change, rerouting their escape from the rear patio straight out the main door. This also decodes that chilling written confession about underestimating her frailty. The author confessed to the exact second their sinister plot derailed. The horrifying instant the victim remained motionless. The crushing realization that their captive was trapped in silence. The exact split second it all unraveled. Yet, this next detail is pure nightmare fuel for detectives, overlooking her deafness. Being completely blind to her severe auditory impairment exposes a massive, glaring hole in their surveillance dossier. These phantoms mapped the security feeds, weaponized patio decor, and perfectly memorized every entry point. They even tracked her exact solitary weekends, yet missed a glaring medical necessity. That triggers two chilling conclusions. First, the mastermind pulling the strings from the shadows wasn't the operative conducting the raid. A disconnect existed between the planner and the muscle. Or perhaps only her deepest confidants knew her secret, hiding her vulnerability behind closed bedroom doors. Regardless of who pulled the strings, the pill bottle paradox stands strong. Every single investigative thread leads to one brutal truth. Nobody actually wanted a payout. Kidnappers demanding cash don't purposely forfeit the one thing keeping their paycheck breathing. One forgotten prescription reveals more horrific truths about that midnight invasion than 60 straight days of police briefings ever could. Let's pivot to the mystery duffel bag. Online sleuths spent weeks guessing, missing what's right on tape. Re-examine the security clip. That particular hiking pack appears stuffed to the absolute limit. Yet, notice the physics when the phantom stretches to blind the lens. The supposedly jam-packed rucksack doesn't sway or ruin their equilibrium. It floats perfectly, defying gravity. The cargo inside definitely isn't bulky hardware or heavy tactical gear. Forget industrial tape, heavy restraints, or binding cords. This intruder ignored the classic toolkit required to successfully lock down a human target. A kidnapping implies a hostage, but this backpack tells a far more sinister story. It held something flat, like a heavy canvas or a thick drop cloth. Snatching a living, breathing captive for cash demands zip ties, duct tape, and shackles. You pack gear to keep a prisoner subdued on the move, but if you intend to haul away a corpse, you bring plastic sheeting. You need a barrier to keep the carnage off your seats, your clothes, and your hands. The exact silhouette of that bag, bulging yet virtually weightless, lacking any sharp contours, it perfectly matches tightly folded protective sheeting. This was never a hostage run. It was a kill kit, packed by someone who guaranteed their target would never draw another breath. Look closely at the planters. 3 separate entryways were wedged ajar the evening Nancy vanished. The rear kitchen entrance blocked open with heavy ceramic. The glass slider to the terrace, jammed open with another planter, alongside a third holding the side yard gate wide open. Every single blockade utilized Nancy's personal garden decor, snatched up in pitch blackness. Placed with zero fumbling by a phantom who memorized her yard, knew the precise weight of those ceramics, and mapped out exactly which hinges needed blocking. Journalist Ashley Banfield corroborated on air that the intruder weaponized Nancy's own landscaping against her to secure those escape routes. The assailant brought no doorstops. They scavenged what was there a chilling indicator of prior reconnaissance on that exact deck. It reeks of an intruder navigating the property purely by muscle memory, reaching blindly into the night and grasping an object perfectly placed in your mind's eye. Break down the actual logistics here. Her rear entrance features a heavy metal mesh barrier that hinges exclusively outward from the left. The killer yanks the mesh, hooks a planter underneath, shoves the main door inward, and kicks a second ceramic into place. Double barriers, single frame, racing against the clock in utter darkness. Absolutely none of this was figured out on the fly. This predator mentally dry ran the breach, or physically scoped it out on a prior, less lethal visit. They also wedged the side fence. That specific barrier borders the carport, the exact spot Tommaso claims he saw Nancy walk into on the evening of January 31st. It funnels straight into the rear access points. The intruder intentionally engineered an unobstructed extraction tunnel leading from the asphalt, cutting directly past the fence. It forged a straight line across the lawn, straight past the jammed hinges, plunging deep into the victim's sanctuary. Random burglars do not engineer tactical pathways. This was a mapped trajectory. Yet one glaring anomaly remains totally unexplained. If the mastermind laid out a clear rear extraction, which the wedged gates heavily imply, why does the gore pool entirely on the front porch? A catastrophic pivot occurred. The blueprint called for an alley escape. Out the rear, hop the masonry, and vanish into a waiting getaway car. Then, a massive wrench got thrown into the gears. A local resident claimed their hound went crazy, aggressively growling toward Nancy's lot at an ungodly hour. Conveniently, that identical neighbor's security footage suffered a blackout precisely angled at the crime scene. That animal never sounds off so late. It picked up on a sinister disturbance lurking behind Nancy's walls. Shifting shadows, an invading force, an undeniable threat creeping through the darkness. The moment the hit squad geared up for a rear departure, and that animal sounded the alarm, the entire tactical equation shattered. Snarling hounds rouse neighborhoods. Blinds peek open. Lenses start recording. The alley was blown. They had to immediately pivot to the street entrance. They rushed past the interior deadbolt that was conveniently disengaged, slipping under a lens intentionally blinded beforehand, spilling out onto the stoop. And, during that frantic detour across the threshold, Nancy's lifeblood permanently stained the pavement. The blocked hinges scream rear departure. The crimson trail proves they fled out the front. That split-second audible between blueprint A and escape B exposes a violent, chaotic breakdown deep inside her living room. A surgical strike devolved into a panicked frenzy. That unseen variable forced them to leak evidence onto a patio that was meant to stay pristine. Let us examine the residence. An official investigator leaked to News Nation on March 31st exactly what Ashley Banfield's insider teased a week prior. Nancy Guthrie's walls held absolutely zero indicators of a violent attack. Detectives labeled the interior completely flawless. Let that sink in, they used the term flawless. Zero smashed decor, zero knocked over chairs, nothing out of place. Not a single microscopic thread of a fight existed within those four walls. The solitary breadcrumbs left behind were the crimson drops on the welcome mat and the purposefully wedged rear hinges. Reporter Brian Enton noted this revelation perfectly aligns with Savannah's claim. When Annie and Tommaso arrived, they acted utterly clueless about the unfolding tragedy. Nancy practically evaporated into thin air. They spun a narrative about a sudden health crisis to explain the drafted entries, claiming utter confusion. A pristine crime scene, zero defensive wounds, a target abducted barefoot wearing nothing but her sleepwear, her cell device abandoned on the bedside table, a wallet brimming with untouched bills, and vital prescriptions sitting idly on the kitchen island. Rear access meticulously pinned back using her own garden decor, and violence isolated entirely at the front. This was never a random home invasion, it was an inside job. Pristine crime scenes hide dark secrets. This wasn't a random snatch and grab. The flawless surroundings scream of an insider who already memorized the floor plan. They navigated the shadows with terrifying precision, zero stumbling, no frantic tossing of rooms, and not a single blind corner bumped. A direct path to the master suite, snatching Nancy, vanishing. We have to loop back and tie those two crucial map coordinates together from my earlier breakdown, because frankly, initially, that convenience store and the web query seemed like isolated clues. But their sinister significance just clicked into place. That exact fueling station practically in their backyard housing, that crypto kiosk, isn't merely a coincidence of proximity. It sits dead center along a highly specific path. The exact corridor linking their driveway directly to the victim's upscale Catalina Foothills estate. You practically brush those pumps commuting. Cruising that stretch on January 31st, or literally any given evening, puts you right in its shadow. A local traveling that path frequently knows exactly what sits inside, a terminal processing the precise digital currency extorted by the kidnappers. Furthermore, that chilling January 11th web query wasn't vaguely pinging from Tucson. It fired from the exact municipality where our shadow figure staked out her porch. We are looking at dual-layered stalking, cyber tracking and boots-on-the-ground creeping, locked onto one victim, executed concurrently from identical coordinates. The person researching her property wasn't some remote hacker surfing across state lines. They breathed the same desert air, lurking right around the corner, waiting. Watch how terrifyingly clear the picture gets once we tear away the kidnapping-for-profit smokescreen. Tossing that assumption out flips the entire narrative upside down. Without an extortion plot, random strangers lack any financial incentive to strike out of nowhere. Unfamiliar attackers gain absolutely nothing. Why would a random thug dedicate 3 weeks to stalking, disable a complex security grid, and drag an 84-year-old grandmother into the darkness? Blaming a nameless drifter completely shatters under basic logic. Peel back the fake extortion plot, leaving one chilling reality: deeply personal intent. Hunting a ghost, needing her erased, driven by family toxicity, looming payouts, domination, or pure elimination. Or perhaps a carefully orchestrated hit funded by an inner circle member, but executed by muscle. That mastermind and muscle dynamic we've been unraveling all along completely crystallizes here. Which brings us to the ironclad front entrance, the single most damning piece of physical evidence we possess. The victim's main entryway was fortified by a massive wrought iron barricade. A local resident, sporting an identical setup, confessed to reporters that bypassing those deadbolts from the street is practically impossible. She bluntly stated, "You simply do not force your way past that steel. A lone wolf cannot compromise that threshold externally. We aren't dealing with simple tumblers to finesse, nor a flimsy frame you can shatter with boots. This specific barricade demands manual release from the interior. That shadowy figure caught lingering on the camera footage? He was completely locked out. He made zero effort to pry the metal. He wasn't jimmying hinges. He just stood there, expecting access. Suddenly, the lock disengages from within. While those abandoned pills absolutely destroy the kidnapping narrative, this unforced entry definitively guarantees an inside job. A phantom was already walking her halls, someone holding the keys. They unlatched the deadbolts from the foyer, either waving the hired muscle inside or dragging the victim right onto the doorstep. Breaching that perimeter strictly requires an accomplice behind the glass. This facilitator was undeniably a familiar face she welcomed over, or a relative possessing a spare key. Every single geographic breadcrumb repeatedly circles back to one claustrophobic 4-mile hot zone. Annie and Tommaso reside a mere 4 miles away, hardly a 10-minute cruise. Conveniently, they hold the title of the final known witnesses. He supposedly delivered her home at 9:50 that evening, claiming he watched the bay doors shut tight. The trail goes totally cold there. Zero surveillance footage backs up her entry. Not a single bystander witnessed the vehicle. The entire post-9:50 timeline relies exclusively on his word. Cue a deafening 14-hour blackout. From late evening until high noon the next afternoon, no check-ins, no messages. Not one relative bothered driving a few minutes to verify an 84-year-old cardiac patient totally deaf without her earpieces sleeping in a severely compromised residence. 14 hours is an absolute lifetime. That provides massive leeway to infiltrate the property, eliminate the target, scrub the forensics, and slip back unnoticed. Securing that massive blind spot demanded just one simple thing: keeping their cell phones totally silent. Neither family member ever bothered dialing her number. Meanwhile, that crypto-enabled fueling station sits practically on their neighborhood block, the sinister web tracking traced to their city. That bizarre extortion message bypassed authorities entirely, landing squarely on Tommaso's private cell. Furthermore, his 19-year musical partner, Dominic Evans, boasts a rap sheet loaded with grand larceny, home invasion, and fraud. A guy perfectly matching the federal prowler profile, residing mere minutes from the target's doorstep. Then consider Annie's vehicle, the blue Honda. Detectives seized that evidence for over 40 days, tearing it apart in an exhaustive sweep before handing it back. Let me be perfectly clear, a 40-day hold is a massive red flag. That timeline screams they were hunting for a very specific clue. Plus, fresh images just dropped, revealing trucks parked at NY's residence, with individuals hauling crates out. Even before Nancy was legally declared deceased, before a death certificate was ever filed, and while this file remains wide open, I am not pointing fingers here, I am simply connecting the dots. Yet every clue circles back to a specific spot 4 miles from NY's porch. The victim's corpse was transported from that exact residence. When a victim is murdered by an intimate partner, the perpetrator almost universally transports the corpse off-site. Not to conceal the homicide, the forensic trace will always remain regardless. They relocate the corpse to shift focus, fabricating a random kidnapping scenario that sends detectives chasing ghosts instead of looking at the inner circle. It remains a classic hallmark in domestic homicide investigations. This entire theatrical display weaves a deliberate lie, the illusion that a random intruder snatched her and vanished. That false narrative only works until you scrutinize the scene and realize a stranger could never navigate those halls with such flawless accuracy. Those extortion letters are pure theatrical props. They serve as a deceptive script layered over the actual bloodshed to disguise the brutal truth. The initial demands drop highly specific facts only a true insider would possess. That bizarre remorse letter was strategically engineered to give relatives psychological peace, so they stop digging. By February 11th, a third message arrives, attempting to peddle tips rather than demanding a hostage payout. That indicates a completely separate agenda, a peripheral player trying to cash in on the tragedy, not the actual killer. But the prescriptions left sitting on the counter absolutely shatter the illusion. An actual hostage taker grabs those life-saving drugs every single time. Yet these perpetrators skip them. Now, reconsider who officially cleared her relatives. Ex-prosecutor Matt Murphy stated recently that he would wager everything he owns that the perpetrator is already sitting in a Pima County cell. He publicly blasted the probe as an absolute circus, insisting the Guthrie relatives deserve true justice. Meanwhile, Sheriff Chris Nanos, the guy who publicly ruled out her loved ones, is bracing for an April 7th sworn tribunal over his fabricated credentials. The local governing board officially mandated that he file all future documents, under penalty of perjury, because top officials no longer trust him to report the facts honestly without facing criminal charges. This is the exact same official who flat out denied a bloody glove existed, even though federal agents recovered it indoors. He actively disputed 4 major broadcast networks regarding those porch camera images. He even shipped genetic evidence to Florida instead of Quantico. Who surrendered the primary location before federal forensics finished? Who blindly let a maintenance guy into a restricted zone? Who mapped a containment area that completely bypassed the crucial surveillance camera? Who leaked classified medical tracking tactics prematurely? And who boldly bragged on local airwaves that he handled everything perfectly with zero remorse? That is the lead detective who supposedly vindicated her inner circle, a man whose own superiors demand he swear on a Bible before speaking. Meanwhile, federal agents are quietly abandoning Tucson. Retired agent Jason Pock believes that unidentified genetic profile, matching neither the victim nor her acquaintances, remains the absolute most critical loose end. He pointed out that ancestral tracing took down the Golden State Killer and has solved mysteries decades older. The technology is practically foolproof. The real issue is whether those lab reports return before the physical samples deteriorate into garbage. Savannah Guthrie hits the Today Show anchor desk April 6th, one day before the sheriff's sworn inquiry. Her relatives are moving on. The hunt is absolutely stalled. Extortion was the very first narrative pushed here. Cameron Guthrie floated that exact scenario during the initial dispatch call, long before any letter showed up. That set the script. The family's public statements, their cash bounties, Savannah's emotional clips, all carefully constructed around the myth of a financially motivated outsider. Yet the physical clues have pointed a wildly different way for weeks now. Those untouched pill bottles are the fatal flaw that destroys their story. Let me break down the facts one last time, because when you see it all together, the reality is chilling. The daily prescriptions stayed right there. A financially motivated abductor packs the medicine. These culprits did not. That backpack holds a flat, creased object resembling plastic sheeting rather than zip ties. You pack a tarp to conceal a corpse. Restraints are for hostages. That bag's outline exposes exactly what happened here. Those planters were snatched off NY's private deck in the pitch black by someone who mapped the layout perfectly. 3 entryways were left ajar. The original scheme meant slipping out the rear. A massive complication hit, forcing their exit route to the front. Porch bloodstains proved that detour wasn't planned. Inside was spotless. 0 signs of a brawl, forced entry, or any chaos. An intruder doesn't glide blind. Whoever crept through those halls knew every single shadow. Those extortion letters spilled secrets only an insider possessed. the smartwatch location, the busted security lights. The author either stood there or got spoon-fed the intel. That bizarre letter of regret shatters the psychological mold of a typical hostage taker. It wasn't penned to secure a payday. It was carefully crafted for closure. The real goal was pointing the family's grief away from Nancy's inner circle, selling a fairy tale about a botched home invasion. That February 11th message to TMZ acted like an outside observer, insisting they reached out straight to Annie and Cameron, not Savannah. Annie and Cameron. That digital shakedown from Derek and Kayla pinged Tommaso Chione's private number. Not Savannah's, not the FBI's, Tommaso's. Kayla runs in the same Tucson underground music circles as Tommaso. That January 11th web query hunting NY's home traced directly to Tucson. Remember that convenience store the federal agents swarmed? The spot housing that crypto machine? It sits mere streets from Annie and Tommaso's beds, miles from NY's property, Annie and Tommaso's turf. Authorities also impounded Annie's vehicle for 40 days. 14 agonizing hours ticked by between someone laying eyes on Nancy and the very first check-in call. The folks who let that window slip live 4 miles away. Worse still, moving cartons are leaving NY's place before she's officially pronounced gone. A phantom removed Nancy Guthrie. They had the property memorized. They dodged the surveillance. They navigated around those patio planters flawlessly. They knew exactly which entries to wedge open. They glided through a pristine residence, leaving every item perfectly intact. They carried a rucksack rigged like a canvas sheet. Yet, they ignored her life-saving prescriptions. Soon after, a shadow player, maybe the culprit, maybe a close accomplice, leaked letters to the press holding intimate crime scene facts. They requested digital coin payouts routed to a kiosk located blocks from the last soul to see Nancy breathing. The entire payoff narrative is completely fabricated. The clue that destroyed that lie rests on a countertop in the Catalina Foothills. The new reality points to a dark corner her relatives desperately hide. A resident out in Tucson holds the absolute key. The breadcrumbs suggest the mastermind was woven into Nancy's life closer than anyone dared to whisper until now. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and comment if you still buy the hostage story today. Our next dive tracks the cash flow, dropping us right on a very specific doorstep. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is a haunting reminder that in our modern connected world, the most dangerous shadows are often the ones we fail to see. This tragedy teaches us a profound lesson about the fragility of safety and the vital importance of protecting our elders. Nancy, a fiercely independent 84-year-old, was taken from the sanctuary of her home, leaving behind the very medication her life depended on. It is a heartbreaking call to action for all of us to look closer at the vulnerable members of our community. We must move beyond ambient surveillance and practice active compassion. A doorbell camera is a bluff if we aren't truly watching out for one another. This case urges us to secure not just our digital footprints, but the physical well-being of those who raised us. Let Nancy's story be a catalyst for change, to check the locks, to verify the insider routines, and to never let silence become the status quo. Safety isn't just a system, it's a shared responsibility. By staying vigilant and speaking up about the smallest inconsistencies, we honor the courage of survivors and ensure that no one else vanishes into the dark.